Remembrance Sunday 2020. Outside, it's wet, it's cold, and actually the church is cold this morning. We cannot gather at the Lord's table. There is no service, but it is Remembrance Sunday. The Lord is here. We are his people. We are called to pray, to remember, to give thanks, and to worship. The reading from the Gospel this morning is about readiness, about staying awake. I remember over the years watching programs on television about the training of recruits for the armed forces, especially for the army. And what struck me in those programs was the repetitive nature of the training, the seemingly exhausting nature of some of that training. It was drummed into those recruits, I remember, how you must always take care of yourself and look after the equipment with which you've been issued. Dirty kit was the greatest sin of all. It makes sense. In their situation, others may have to put their lives in your hands. What use is it to you if your weapons are rusty, if it doesn't work? How far will you be able to walk if your boots aren't clean, if they're not comfortable, if you haven't looked after them? How long will you keep yourself going if you have not trained and kept yourself in good condition? When I was 16, I had to begin a steep learning curve. I left home and I went to sea. I had to learn basic things like the need to rinse out your washing well so as to avoid sweat rash in the tropics, Dobie rash we called it. And also the need when you were on lookout or as a watchkeeper, the need always to be alert, to be in a fit state to do your work, and always, however pointless it seemed, to scan the trackless sea. It would be tempting on a long and uneventful crossing of the Pacific, for instance, to rely on the autopilot and to switch off. Then how would you see the distress signal of someone who needed your help? I remember going to college as a 17-year-old, and amongst the cadets with me was a young man called Douglas Robertson. With his family, they had set sail across the Pacific. His father was a seafarer. Their boat came to grief, and they found themselves cast away on the sea, thousands of miles from land. It was with bitterness that he recounted how at least one ship had sailed right past them, ignoring their signals. There was no one on watch. Eventually, after 50 or 60 days, when they were almost close to death, they were picked up by fishermen. They were saved because someone looked out, someone was ready, someone was doing their duty. In their case, it was a Korean fisherman. In this parable, because going to sleep on watch in my day was the most heinous misdemeanor, and for good reason. Jesus, in this parable about the wise and the foolish bridesmaid, urged his disciples always to keep awake. Maybe there's an irony intended in this story. After all, we remember how these same disciples fell asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane as their Lord was praying in agony and sweating like drops of blood falling from his head. They were asleep as he prayed. They were asleep as his enemies drew near in the darkness. I don't think Jesus was ordering his disciples to be insomniacs. Neither do I think that at sea one person can remain on watch for days on end. That would be ridiculous, not to mention dangerous. Each person has to take their turn on duty while the others rest. Jesus sent out his disciples not alone, but 2 by 2, so that they could rely upon one another, staying awake, being prepared. When I think of that today, I think about the nurses at Hexham Hospital this year, those who have young children and vulnerable partners and family members, those who separated themselves from their families and moved into rented accommodation so that they could continue to care for infectious patients and in the event of falling ill themselves, protect their own families. They were prepared, they were ready. I think of hospital staff at Hexham who every winter, when snow and ice make it hazardous to travel, stay overnight at the hospital at the end of their working day rather than going home, so that in the morning they will be ready for work. It's about caring for their patients. It's about supporting their colleagues. It's about putting others first. This way of life, this sense of duty that they have, it's something which has been passed down to them by those who worked before them, those with whom they trained. And that same sense of duty is today being passed on to those who enter that profession. Every year, as Remembrance Sunday comes round, there are fewer veterans of the World War remaining to bear witness. It's important, and it's as important as ever, to remember the service and the sacrifice of them and of others, both those who went eagerly and the reluctant heroes, those, whoever they were, who put their lives on the line to defeat that ruthless evil that the world faced in that time of war, and in order to safeguard our freedoms. It's important that we should be aware of the scars and the wounds which people and nations bear to this day, important for us to be awake. As a church today, we are unable to come together to worship and to sing. It's tempting for us to switch off and to think we should go into a sort of hibernation. But on your notice sheet, there is a list of those who have asked for your prayers. It's not a kind of shopping list. It's a list of people who believe that you and I are lifting them to God in our prayers. We who can pray must pray for those who cannot. We who can remember must do so for those who no longer can remember. Every day, it is my duty and your duty to pray, and to teach others so to do, in order that in times of trial we may be ready. Amen.